The jungle was alive with sound. Chittering creatures skittered across thick, gnarled roots while distant howls echoed through the misty canopy. It was the kind of place where silence meant something was hunting. Captain Elias Voss crouched low, his pulse steady as he scanned the perimeter of the human outpost. His rifle, sleek and well-worn, rested against his shoulder, though he had no intention of firing unless necessary. They were being watched. He could feel it. Beyond the artificial perimeter of the base, hidden within the undergrowth, shadowed figures lingered. Not the feral kind that pounced without thought. No, these were calculating, waiting. Var'Kari, the dominant species of Ravnok. They were towering, muscle-bound creatures with thick, ridged hides and golden eyes that gleamed like molten metal. Their presence was a warning and a test all at once. The humans weren't welcome here. Dr. Mira Cade moved carefully beside him, her dark curls damp with sweat as she kept her gaze fixed on a tablet filled with pulsating readings. Unlike Elias, she wasn't a soldier. She was an observer, a translator of ecosystems, a whisperer of alien biology. It was why she had come, to understand the creatures that ruled this world. 3 of them, she murmured. Chief Karax and his 2 guards. Same as yesterday. Elias exhaled through his nose. Karax had been circling their operations for weeks, never speaking, never engaging. Just watching, as if waiting for the humans to misstep. They're assessing us, Elias said, his voice low, still deciding whether we're a threat. Myra's gaze flickered toward the dense tree-line. And what do we think of them? Before he could answer, a deep growl rumbled through the air. The sound didn't come from the Var'Kari. It came from something else. A blur of motion, sudden and violent, crashed through the underbrush. The moment stretched, a beat of instinct before action. Scarhound. The creature was all sinew and death, its elongated snout lined with jagged teeth, blackened claws scraping against the dirt as it lunged toward the outpost's boundary. It was wounded, its ribs visible beneath torn flesh, but its hunger burned brighter than its pain. Elias snapped his rifle up. He had the shot. One pull of the trigger, and it would be over. But Mira moved first. She stepped into the beast's path, her hands raised, not in defense, but in understanding. Easy, she whispered. The Scarhound snarled, its body coiled in agony, yet it hesitated. The Var'Kari watched from the trees, their golden eyes unblinking. Elias tightened his grip. One wrong move, and this would end in blood. The beast's breathing was ragged. It swayed on its feet, its body failing before its mind would allow surrender. Mira crouched, slow and deliberate, and extended her hand. The jungle held its breath. Then, impossibly, the Scarhound staggered forward. It didn't attack. It didn't flee. It collapsed at her feet, exhaustion finally winning. Mira moved swiftly, producing a small injector from her belt. A precise dose of sedative. Not a bullet. Not a blade. Elias exhaled, lowering his rifle as the tension in the air thinned, like a storm rolling past. A heavy footstep sounded beyond the perimeter. Chief Karax emerged from the tree line. He was taller than the others, his dark, mottled hide marked by scars that told the story of 100 battles. His eyes flicked from the Scarhound to Mira, then to Elias, measuring their every breath. His voice, when it came, was a slow, deliberate growl. You do not kill your enemy. Mira rose, unshaken. This one wasn't our enemy, just desperate. Karax tilted his head. Weak. Elias finally spoke. Not weak. Injured. There's a difference. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the alien's face. Then his gaze shifted downward. A smaller figure stepped forward from behind him, barely reaching the height of Elias's waist. A Var'Kari cub, young but not helpless. Its golden eyes, wider and less hardened than its elders, locked onto the scene with curiosity rather than judgment. The cub took a step closer to Elias, Another toward Mira. Karax tensed. Elias held still, letting the moment play out. The cub sniffed at the air, then at the unconscious scarhound. It turned its head slightly, as if searching for an answer in something beyond instinct. And then it did something no Var'Kari had ever done before. It reached out, hesitant but determined, and touched Myra's outstretched hand. A slow, deliberate gesture of trust. Karax's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. Elias had spent enough years in war zones and diplomatic crises to recognize what was happening. This wasn't just an interaction. It was a fracture in the unspoken barrier between their species. The Var'Kari had never trusted humans. But this cub, this single, fearless child, was questioning that truth. Karax rumbled something in his native tongue, sharp and final. The cub hesitated, but eventually obeyed, retreating behind its elder. Without another word, Karax turned and disappeared into the jungle, his guards following. The cub looked back once before vanishing into the shadows. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. Mira exhaled, pressing a hand against her chest, as if releasing a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. "What just happened?" she asked. Elias adjusted his rifle strap, eyes still locked on the empty space where the Var'Kari had stood. "They're testing us," he murmured. Mira frowned. "For what?" He finally turned to her, expression unreadable. "To see if we deserve to live." The jungle whispered around them, and somewhere, deep in the undergrowth, golden eyes continued to watch. The jungle pulsed with unseen life, a vast and breathing entity that watched from the shadows. The thick canopy swallowed the sky, allowing only fractured moonlight to pierce through, casting ghostly shapes onto the damp earth. Every step Elias took was deliberate, his senses stretched to their limits as he led the patrol deeper into Var'Kari territory. Tarvai was nestled against Myra's side, his small form dwarfed by the humans around him. The cub had refused to stay behind. He had insisted, in halting but determined human speech, that he would walk with them. The decision had been made in seconds, but Elias knew its implications would ripple far beyond this night. Mira crouched beside him as they approached a ridge, her voice low. "Something doesn't feel right." Elias nodded, scanning the tree line through the scope of his rifle. The silence was wrong. The jungle was never truly quiet. There was always movement, distant calls, the rustle of leaves disturbed by unseen creatures. But now the world held its breath. Then the wind shifted, and the stench hit them. Iron, decay, blood. Mira cursed under her breath. Bodies. They moved quickly, descending into the ravine below. The bodies of Var'Kari warriors lay scattered across the clearing, their lifeless eyes catching the moonlight. The wounds were deep, brutal, some inflicted by claws, others by weapons of human design. "This wasn't a clean fight," Elias muttered. Mira knelt beside one of the corpses, pressing 2 fingers to his still warm forehead. They were ambushed. Elias turned to Tarvai, but the cub's expression was unreadable. His claws dug into the fabric of Myra's sleeve, his small body tensed, as if waiting for something unseen. Then the sound came, a guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the trees. Elias spun, rifle raised. Shadows shifted in the undergrowth. Eyes glowed in the darkness. They weren't alone. The attack came fast. The first figure burst from the foliage with terrifying speed. A Var'Kari warrior, but not like the others. His armor was jagged, worn with the scars of exile, his fangs bared in something between a snarl and a grin. More followed, their massive forms cutting through the undergrowth with lethal precision. Rog'Thar's forces. Elias fired the moment the first warrior launched. His rifle's pulse round struck the Var'Kari square in the chest, sending him reeling back with a howl of pain. But the others didn't stop. They crashed into the squad, claws flashing, the night erupting into chaos. Mira pivoted, her sidearm kicking against her palm as she took down another attacker. One of the soldiers beside her was less fortunate. A Var'Kari warrior slammed into him, claws raking across his armor, dragging him to the ground before he could scream. Elias moved on instinct, cutting through the fray with calculated precision. The air was thick with the scent of blood and sweat, every breath laced with the metallic tang of violence. Then he heard it, a cry, small but sharp. Tarvai. Elias turned in time to see a massive figure wrench the cub from Myra's side. Tarvai thrashed, claws scratching against thick armor, but the warrior holding him barely reacted. And then the moonlight revealed his face. Rog'Thar. The warlord's grin was all teeth, his golden eyes glinting with cruel amusement as he held the struggling cub aloft. You dare stand among humans? Well, his voice was a deep, rumbling growl, vibrating through the battlefield. He turned his gaze to Elias, assessing, amused. And you would fight for something that is not your own. Elias aimed his rifle. Put him down. Rog'Thar's grip tightened around Tarvai, claws pressing against the cub's throat. He is weak, he snarled, unfit to bear the name of our kind. And you would make him weaker. Elias didn't hesitate. His shot was precise, a pulse round aimed straight for Rog'Thar's wrist. The warlord twisted at the last second, avoiding the direct hit, but the impact was enough. His grip loosened, and Tarvai fell. Mira was already moving, catching the cub before he hit the ground, tucking him protectively against her side. Rog'Thar bared his teeth. You fight for him. His voice was thick with contempt. Then you will share his fate. The warlord lunged. Elias barely had time to react before Rog'Thar was on him. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, rifle skidding from his grasp. Rog'Thar loomed over him, claws raised. Elias rolled just as the strike came down, the warlord's claws raking deep into the earth where his head had been a moment before. He kicked out, catching Rog'Thar in the side, but the warlord barely flinched. Elias reached for his sidearm, but Rog'Thar was faster. A massive hand closed around his wrist, crushing with impossible strength. You are nothing, Rog'Thar hissed. A creature that should know its place. Elias gritted his teeth against the pain, forcing himself to stay focused. Rog'Thar was stronger, but strength wasn't everything. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Mira. Rog'Thar turned slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and it was enough. Elias drove his knee into the warlord's gut, twisting free as Rog'Thar staggered. The warlord roared in frustration, but before he could retaliate, a burst of gunfire forced him back. Mira stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle leveled. Time to go. Elias didn't waste time. He grabbed Tarvai, tucking the cub against his chest, and sprinted toward the trees. The rest of the squad followed, covering their retreat with bursts of suppressing fire. Rog'Thar's enraged snarl echoed behind them, a promise of blood yet to be spilled. But they had what they came for. They had Tarvai, and now the war was inevitable. The jungle burned. Thick columns of smoke twisted through the night air, the acrid stench of scorched vegetation mingling with the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The ground trembled with distant impacts, heavy footfalls, the clash of bodies, the dying roars of the fallen. Elias ran. Branches snapped against his armor as he pushed through the dense undergrowth, his rifle held tight, boots pounding against damp earth. His breath came hard, adrenaline flooding his veins. The sounds of battle raged ahead. Tarvai was out there. The cub's panic cries had echoed through the calms minutes ago, a high-pitched keening that had cut through the static before silence swallowed a whole. The ambush had been swift, brutal. Rog'Thar, the exiled warlord, had struck with overwhelming force, his band of rogue Var'Kari descending upon the hunting grounds where Tarvai and his kin had wandered. It was a challenge, an act of defiance meant to shatter Carax's rule. And now, The cub, the only one who had dared trust a human, was in the hands of a warlord who saw such a thing as an unforgivable sin. Elias pushed faster. His team flanked him, moving with deadly efficiency through the alien terrain. Myra's voice crackled over the comms. "Signal's weak. They're moving deeper into the valley." Then we moved faster. Up ahead, the jungle parted, revealing a jagged ravine cut through the land like an open wound. Fires rage along the ridge, the bodies of fallen Var'Kari warriors littering the ground. Their golden eyes, once burning with the fire of their kind, were now dim and lifeless. And beyond them, standing atop the battlefield, Rog'Thar loomed. The warlord was a behemoth, even by Var'Kari standards. His dark hide was marked with ritual scars, each one carved from a battle won, a foe crushed beneath his claws. His armor, an amalgamation of bone and metal, was drenched in fresh blood. In one massive hand, he held a struggling form, Tarvai. The cub writhed in his grip, his small claws raking at the warlord's thick skin, but it was like a storm lashing against stone. Rog'Thar barely acknowledged the effort, his attention locked onto the humans that had dared enter his war. "You come for the cub," he rumbled, voice like grinding stone. Elias leveled his rifle. "Put him down." Rog'Thar's lips curled in something between amusement and disgust. "You would make demands of me, human? You, who have no place in this war." He lifted Tarvai higher, claws flexing against the cub's throat. "This whelp is weak. He would rather crawl to lesser creatures than stand with his own kind." His eyes burned. That weakness must be purged. Elias moved before the thought even fully formed. A single shot rang out, precise and unyielding. The impact struck Rog'Thar's wrist, a calculated blow that forced his grip to falter just enough. In that fraction of a second, Tarvai twisted free, dropping toward the ravine's edge. Elias didn't hesitate. He lunged, boots skidding against the blood-slick ground, and caught the cub mid-fall. The impact sent them both tumbling, rolling dangerously close to the drop before Elias dug his fingers into the dirt, stopping their descent just in time. Above them, Rog'Thar roared, fury bleeding into the air like a living thing. The warlord moved to strike, but Elias was already up, shoving Tarvai behind him. The Var'Kari cub clung to his leg, trembling but alive. Elias raised his rifle again. The rest of his squad had formed a line, their weapons trained on the warlord and his remaining forces. Myra's voice was cold steel. "Back down." For a long moment, Rog'Thar simply stared. Then, slowly, his lips pulled back in something between a sneer and a grin. "You think your weapons make you powerful?" He stepped forward, unfazed. "You are prey that has learned to bare its teeth. Nothing more." Elias didn't flinch. "And you're a dead man walking." A low rumble built in the warlord's chest. It took a moment for Elias to realize it was laughter. Then, without warning, Rog'Thar lunged. Elias fired. The battle exploded in an instant. Gunfire tore through the night, bright flashes of energy rounds colliding with dark figures. The jungle erupted into chaos, Var'Kari warriors clashing with human forces in a brutal, close-quarter struggle. Rog'Thar was fast, faster than something of his size had any right to be. He barreled through Elias's line of fire, swiping with claws that could shear through steel. Elias dodged, barely, the force of the swing sending him skidding backward. He rolled, bringing his rifle up for another shot. Too late. Rog'Thar was already there. A massive fist connected with Elias's chest, the impact like being hit by a collapsing building. His armor absorbed some of the force, but not enough. The world spun, and he was on his back, the cold bite of stone at his spine. Above him, the warlord loomed, a jagged blade glinting in his grip. "This is where you die, human." Elias tasted blood. His fingers tightened around his weapon, but the angle was wrong. Then a blur of motion. Small, fast. "Tarvai." The cub leaped on a Rog'Thar's arm, tiny claws finding purchase in the warlord scars. He didn't do much damage, but it was enough. Enough to shift Rog'Thar's attention. Enough to give Elias the opening he needed. Elias drove his knife upward. The blade sank deep, right between the warlord's ribs. Rog'Thar snarled, a sound of rage and disbelief. He staggered back, grasping at the wound as thick, dark blood spilled from his chest. Elias forced himself to his feet, lungs burning. He met the warlord's gaze, unflinching. "You lost," he said, voice steady. Rog'Thar swayed. His body fought against the inevitable, but even a creature like him could not ignore a mortal wound. His knees buckled, and with a final, rasping breath, he collapsed. Dead. The battlefield fell still. The remaining Var'Kari warriors hesitated. Without their leader, their fight had no meaning. One by one, they stepped back, retreating into the jungle shadows. It was over. Elias exhaled sharply, his grip loosening on his weapon. Then he felt a small, trembling weight press against his leg. Tarvai looked up at him, wide golden eyes filled with something Elias had never seen in a Var'Kari before. Gratitude. Elias knelt, pressing a steadying hand to the cub's head. "We're going home," he murmured. Tarvai didn't let go. The dawn broke slowly over the jungle, bleeding red and gold through the canopy, painting the battlefield in a quiet, eerie glow. The fires from the night's battle had burned low, leaving only curling trails of smoke that twisted into the morning air. The scent of blood still clung to the earth, but the war was over. Elias stood at the edge of the ravine, arms crossed, watching as Karax and his warriors moved through the wreckage. They did not mourn the dead with wails or ceremony. Instead, they moved among the fallen, pressing clawed hands to cooling foreheads, speaking quiet words in a language Elias did not understand. He didn't need a translation. The weight in the air was grief enough. Tarvai stood beside him, small and silent, watching his people with an expression that was far too old for a cub. The events of the night had left him shaken, but not broken. He had seen death, felt the weight of survival on his tiny shoulders, and yet he remained. Elias could respect that. Mira approached from behind, her voice soft but firm. "Med teams have patched up the wounded. We're preparing to move back to the outpost." Elias nodded but didn't move. His gaze remained locked on Karax, who knelt beside Rog'Thar's lifeless body, his expression unreadable. The warlord had been a tyrant, but he had also been a warrior of his kind, a challenger to the old ways. His death was a turning point, but whether it would lead to peace or more war remained uncertain. Karax finally stood, turning to face Elias. Their eyes met across the battlefield, a silent exchange passing between them. Then, without a word, the Var'Kari chief strode forward, stopping just a few feet away. "You fought for one of our own," Karax said, his voice quieter than Elias had ever heard it. "You bled for him." His golden eyes flickered to Tarvai, then back to Elias. "Tell me, human, why?" Elias held his gaze. "Because he needed me." Karax studied him for a long moment, searching for deception. Finding none, he exhaled a slow breath. "You should not have interfered." Elias shrugged. "Probably not." The Var'Kari chief's expression shifted, something almost like amusement flashing across his features. "And yet you did." His gaze drifted to Tarvai, who stood unmoving at Elias's side. "He chose you." Elias didn't respond. The truth was evident in the way the cub stood closer to him than to his own kind, in the way his small fingers clenched at Elias's sleeve, seeking silent reassurance. Karax seemed to war with something internal, a battle between instinct and something deeper, something unspoken. Finally, he turned slightly, addressing the gathered warriors. "Hear me," he rumbled, his voice carrying through the clearing. "The blood of our kind has been spilled, but we are not lesser for it. We are still Var'Kari." His golden gaze swept across them. But the world changes. Even predators must decide whether to adapt or be hunted in turn. A murmur passed through the gathered warriors, a mixture of uncertainty and contemplation. Karax turned back to Elias. You have done what no human has before. You have earned the loyalty of one of our own. He looked down at Tarvai. That is not a bond one will break. Elias felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He knew what Karax was saying. Tarvai had made a choice, and Karax would honor it. The chief knelt before the cub, speaking in their native tongue. The words were low, steady, but carried the weight of finality. Tarvai listened, small hands tightening into fists. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Karax stood, turning back to Elias. He is yours now. Elias stiffened. Wait. Karax cut him off. Do not mistake this for weakness, Captain. He is Var'Kari. He will always be Var'Kari. But he has chosen to walk with you. His gaze was sharp, piercing. Guide him well. Elias had faced warlords, insurgents, and mercenaries across countless worlds. He had stared down death more times than he could count. But standing here, with a cub barely reaching his waist looking up at him with unwavering trust, he felt the weight of responsibility in a way he never had before. Mira placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Looks like you've got a new recruit. Elias exhaled, shaking his head with a wry smirk. Yeah, looks like it. Karax turned, motioning for his warriors to move. The jungle swallowed them one by one, their massive forms vanishing into the mist. Elias looked down at Tarvai. The cub stared back, unblinking. Well, kid, Elias muttered. Welcome to the team. Tarvai grinned, sharp little teeth gleaming. The jungle was still watching, but for the first time, Elias didn't feel like prey.